You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 16th of January 2026 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Cermak. Coming up on today's program, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky finds himself once again having to explain why Russia and not Ukraine is an obstacle to peace, also declaring a state of emergency over energy. After that,
one never takes winning a Nobel-Prize for granted. It's a lottery ticket. But, of course, it was very rewarding and emotional.
We'll hear from the Nobel-Prize winning economist Richard Thaler. And then, sticking sort of with the field of economics, it is the World Economic Forum next week. Monocle's Carlotta Rebello, you will be there for us.
Yes, Chris, under the theme A Spirit of Dialogue, a record 400 top political leaders, including close to 65 heads of state and government, are heading to Davos next week, and we'll be going through some of the key items in the agenda.
That and a key risk survey they're releasing this week as well. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Cermak. A very happy Friday to all of our listeners out there. We're going to start today's show with Ukraine, where President Volodymyr Zelensky has declared a state of emergency over the country's energy sector after Russia's latest attack on a major energy facility near the eastern city of Kharkiv, coming in the dead of winter. Zelensky has also pointed to that Russian attack to fend off a comment from US President Donald Trump that Zelensky and not Vladimir Putin is standing in the way of peace. Well, joining me now is Monocle writer and Ukraine expert Jenne right here in the studio. Julia, good to have you.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So tell us a bit about this attack overnight, what we know, and also paint a picture for us. You've been in Ukraine, obviously, also over the winter. What is it like over the winter right now in Ukraine? How does one go about keeping the lights on, the heating on in the dead of winter?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we start with the attack last night, it happened, as you said, in the middle of the night, in the dead of the night, around 1 a.m. And it left 400,000 civilians without power and without heating, without lights in Kharkiv, in the city of Kharkiv. But if we look at, the kind of the picture of what is winter like in Ukraine, this is actually one of the worst winters in 10 years. Really, the last one that people can remember is back in, 2014, 2015. It's hard to imagine a pavement that is, for example, if we just imagine pavements for a moment, pavement that is so slippy that the municipal authorities don't even have time to kind of scatter salt over it, and people are sort of slipping and sliding. It's very dangerous when the lights are very low in the evening for anyone, really, but especially older people with severe mobility issues. If we look inside people's homes, people are using all sorts of ways to stay warm, from heating bricks on their gas hob stoves or warming themselves up as they use their gas to kind of heat themselves some food. We've had people who don't actually have gas in their homes at all because of shortages or because of the strikes. And we have them setting up field kitchens in the courtyards outside their multi-block story apartments, which is something we saw actually, in Mariupol when that city was under siege by the Russians. So this is very sort of primitive kind of standards that Ukrainians are being forced to kind of go down to. We have people, of course, wearing as many layers as they can, but also people going to these resilience centres that have been set up by the government, and actually quite a few have also been donated by foreign governments. So these are sort of like inflatable tents, really, that are being set up ad hoc around the city, and people go there to charge their phones, to get warm. Children go there to do their homework. If we talk about schools as well, secondary schools, they have not opened yet since the Christmas holidays. So children are still at home, and there's talk of, schools not opening until the 1st of February, by the time schools have had time to, recalibrate to the new reality they're working in. And summer holidays, which are notoriously in Ukraine, well, for me anyway, I was always so jealous of all my Ukrainian friends. Ukrainian summer holidays are 3-4 months long. These will now be cut down because the year has been so disrupted by these energy strikes. And so that's kind of even the school year itself is being shifted along. So, and even supermarkets. I mean, there are so many ways in which life is being affected, but even supermarkets, some supermarkets in the worst affected areas of Kyiv, and the Kyiv region is really the most affected region in Ukraine, even they are shutting down potentially.
You paint such a picture there, Julia, of what it's like on the ground. Do you have any sense of like what a state of emergency does? Do you have a sense of kind of how you talked about some of the things that the government is doing with these resilience centres? How are they trying to respond to this?
I think it's just about speeding up the processes that happen internally of repairing sites. So perhaps kind of bypassing some red tape that might be holding things back. And it's also about bringing in equipment from abroad. So procuring batteries, generators, and so on and so forth, using state funds to shore up, Ukrainian access to power. And we've seen small generators being set up to power, a block of flats or a kind of a neighbourhood or whatever. And private homes relying on their own private generators or battery packs and things like that.
So in the midst of all of this came Donald Trump's comment yesterday in an interview with Reuters where he was kind of asked point blank who he thinks is the obstacle to peace. And he said Volodymyr Zelensky. We've talked about this many times on this show, Julia, but were you surprised at a comment like that from Donald Trump, or has this just become par for the course?
Absolutely. It's sort of in the background now. And if we can get into this topic now of how Ukraine is very much diversifying away from the US. There has been no serious US help in the last year since Donald Trump came to office. His comments almost don't affect Ukraine anymore. And there was a staggering statistic yesterday from President Macron of France. He said that now France supplies 2/3 of all of Ukraine's intelligence needs. This was the big thing holding back Ukrainians from openly criticizing Trump. Of course, we are still going, Ukrainians are still going to be attempting to curry favor with US officials. But there is this real idea now that whatever Trump says, it is very clear who his friends are, who he wants to build his sort of partnerships with. And it's not Ukraine and it's not Zelensky. Intelligence, the intelligence card, that was the real thing holding Ukrainians back because intelligence is so vital for the front line. And of course, in our conversation, we haven't even mentioned the conditions under which soldiers are living on the front line. They don't have shelters to hide under. They are in trenches in -15, -20 degrees Celsius conditions. If you just imagine that for 1 second, I don't think any of us could really put up with that for very long. But intelligence, and of course intelligence also for missile strikes on Ukraine, for those strikes that are now damaging the energy sector. And so that statistic was so staggering from Macron, and I think it really helped people see how much Ukraine is really working with its allies to decouple from the US.
Just finally, Julie, though, even if there is not that much hope anymore when it comes to Donald Trump in Ukraine, we're going to be speaking about Davos in just a moment, the World Economic Forum. And just from your perspective, Donald Trump is going to be there. Volodymyr Zelensky is going to be there as well. We understand there will be some sort of meeting, although in that Reuters interview, Trump said there was no plan for that meeting. Are you expecting anything from that?
I think this is actually going to be quite a tricky diplomatic tightrope for Zelensky to walk because at home, of course, there's so much sort of anger at Trump and what Trump has done to Ukraine because his hand is very much involved in these energy strikes in Ukraine in terms of cutting off, missile defense systems to Ukraine. That is a direct kind of effect on the conditions that Ukrainians are living in right now. What we will see at Davos is potentially a meeting about that special economic agreement that we saw so much kind of controversy around in Ukraine. So this is the US going in and having these contracts, exclusive contracts for mining Ukrainian land, for, developing Ukraine economically, business links, business ties, all that sort of stuff. Apparently, according to Zelensky's office, there's an $800 billion deal that potentially may be signed in Davos. But Ukrainian analysts now are really looking at how much this economic deal can affect Ukraine's sovereignty and Ukraine's independence in terms of being able to trade with the EU, those kind of links with the rest of the world other than just sort of being a colony of the US really is how those early drafts of that economic agreement looked. So I think that is going to be a very tricky negotiation to have with Trump's team if this meeting happens.
Julia Jenne, Monocle writer and Ukraine expert, thank you very much for joining us today. And now here's Hassan Anderson with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. A Seoul court has sentenced disgraced former South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol to 5 years in prison after finding him guilty on charges related to his failed 2024 declaration of martial law, marking the first verdict related to a range of criminal charges he is currently facing. Yoon is appealing the ruling and faces a separate insurrection case that could carry a much harsher sentence. Norway has reacted with disbelief after Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado presented her Nobel Peace Prize medal to US President Donald Trump in a symbolic gesture following her meeting at the White House. The Nobel Committee has stressed peace prizes cannot be transferred, underscoring the controversy of the move. France's finance minister has warned that any US action against Greenland could seriously jeopardize economic ties between Europe and Washington amid ongoing tension over US interest in the Arctic territory. Paris says such a move would cross a red line and threaten EU-US trade relations. Australian officials have declared victory in their child social media ban after about 4.7 million accounts identified as belonging to under-16s were shut down by major platforms. The government says the closures show the law is working to protect children online, despite concerns about enforcement and digital rights. Those are today's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Hassan. Now, for decades, economists had assumed that us humans were rational beings capable of making sound financial decisions. Well, that began to change with the economist Richard Thaler, who wrote a series of columns in the 1980s and 90s, laying out so-called anomalies in our behaviours and how we deal with money. Richard Thaler's first book, The Winner's Curse, put him on a path to the Nobel-Prize and ushered in the field of behavioural economics. The book has recently been updated with the help of another economist, Alex Imus, and I spoke with Richard Thaler at Midori House. I began by asking him whether he knew from the outset of his career that he would be creating an entirely new field of economics.
I don't know that I thought of this as creating a field, but the introduction to the first one does talk about Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions. I don't think I was allowed to say at 39 or 40 that I'm trying to create a revolution, but you could think it. And
so you did think it.
I could think it. And I thought publishing this series of facts would help. So I spent a lot of my time over the next 4 years crafting these articles once a quarter. And when there was enough of them to look like a respectable book, I kind of stapled them together. In 1992 was the original version of this book.
The book is The Winner's Curse, and as you say, it was the original version was 1992, and now there is an update that is being released, which really is a good way to talk about your career and what's happened in the interim, because you did mention you've written a memoir before which talks more about kind of behavioral economics and your relationship with it. But this book is interesting because it is looking at those anomalies you first identified and then providing updates to them, looking at sort of where they stand today. And I'm just curious what it was like going through that process for you. Also the fact that you had another economist who's writing this book with you be the one who provided the updates. What did that feel like? Were you nervous?
I would say I wasn't that nervous, in part because many of the findings I could replicate and did replicate every class I taught. So I, for many years, taught a course called Managerial Decision Making. And before the class started, we would do a survey of the students. And many of the original findings we would reproduce. And when I would teach a class, I would say, look, this is what the subjects in this experiment published in 1970-something. You think those guys are just dumb. Well, here's what you guys did when we asked you the same question. So if there had been a problem, I would have known. Every one of these things I could and did replicate in real time in my classroom. But the reason for bringing Alex on board was to have a more thorough dig into the literature.
As you say, it's not really about nervous whether these still hold today or not, but it's about acceptance. It's about whether the theories that you proposed at the time, the anomalies you identified, were something that were then taken up into economics. In this chapter where you talk about time and how people make decisions present versus future and so on and so forth, which is such an important part of what you did, you say at the end, and Alex challenges you on this, that it may have policy implications when it clearly does. The idea of how we go about making decisions, that we actually want things now rather than later. Alex challenges you on that in his update. He says you were too cautious at the time by saying it may. Of course it had policy implications. Was he right? Were you cautious?
Yes, he's right. I was cautious. In the 80s and 90s, this field was very controversial. And I was considered a heretic. I didn't mind that, but I wanted to be considered a scientific heretic, not a political heretic. So I was finding anomalies, say, in the stock market. There was a famous Nobel-Prize winning economist at the University of Chicago who thought that if people took me seriously, they would no longer trust financial exchanges to be the way we decide how much money companies get. And he thought that was very worrying.
Because we want to assume people are rational when they're dealing with money and financial markets.
Well, I think his view was the last thing he wanted was the government intervening and deciding who should get funding. Like, now we're all talking about AI, and they're raising trillions of dollars. Is that a bubble? Many people are asking that question. This Professor Merton Miller is now deceased. He would have been horrified at the idea that government would make investments. Of course, the government just recently did make an investment in one of these big companies. And it's a Republican president, so I'm not sure whether he's rolling in the grave over there. But in any case, in the early days, I just stayed away from policy prescriptions. And of course, later, I got braver and decided to maybe stick my nose into that.
Before this book, when you did receive the Nobel Prize in 2017, that moment for you, did that feel like that recognition from your peers? Or had you already been confident in your place, despite maybe some of the naysayers and those who would resist the idea that behaviors play a role in economics?
Well, one never takes winning a Nobel Prize for granted. It's a lottery ticket that comes as a surprise in the middle of the night if you live in the U.S. or awakened at 4 a.m. But, of course, it was very rewarding and emotional.
Just finally, then, there is another topic in your book or another chapter that is on cooperation. This was also an interesting finding that you had back through your career, basically saying people are less selfish than we think there are. There are less free riders in the world than we expect there to be. How does that square with our current politics? Maybe a little less focused on that cooperation that you identify in economics. Do we kind of need to relearn almost that lesson? Look at economics, look at your studies to say, hey, we're actually pretty good at cooperation if we just think about it a little more.
Well, we won't go deeply into politics, but I will say that there are almost no economists who think that President Trump's philosophy about tariffs are a good idea. The idea of comparative advantage, meaning that some countries are naturally suited to doing some things. I wouldn't recommend starting a coffee farm in the UK, maybe champagne, but not coffee. right? You need sunny, hot weather. So I think some basic economics training would help. But I think more important is the point you're bringing up, which is that in any society, you achieve more if you cooperate. And the go it alone policy of being a bullying gets adverse reactions. And, I wrote that book, most of it, the original, when I was teaching at Cornell University. And it's a beautiful place. There are waterfalls and streams, and there are a couple of one-lane bridges near the university. And there are farm stands that put out vegetables, and there's a box to put money in, and the box is nailed down. And that's the view of human nature that I was focused on when I was writing these columns. I wrote at the time that those farmers have the right model of human nature, that there are enough cooperative people out there in the world that it's worthwhile putting out the fresh vegetables and counting on people to put the money in the box. But you better nail down the box, because there are enough scoundrels that will just take the money if you leave it out there. That's the model of the world that I have, and I think it would be good if we all understood that model.
Richard Thaler there. You can hear more from Richard in The Big Interview on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. His newly updated book is called The Winner's Curse: Behavioral Economics Then and Now. This is The Briefing. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Cermak. Now, as just mentioned, next week marks that annual confab that is the World Economic Forum in Davos, a who's who of entrepreneurs and politicians and political leaders. And among that who's who will be our very own Carlotta Rebello, Monocle's executive producer and senior foreign correspondent. Carlotta, welcome. Good to have you here before you go.
Nice to be here.
Are you excited for this? We have done this once before together as well, to go to Davos. Are you excited for the trek up into the mountains?
It's always so exciting to make the trip from Zurich all the way up to Davos. The scenery is just so incredible. But yes, as we were kind of hinting there with Julia, it's going to be quite an interesting one to watch. Not just because the temperatures are saying minus 16 degrees for the week, but indeed because of what will be the temperature in the room. No one actually knows.
Trump will be raising the temperatures.
Exactly.
Perhaps.
You might remember that last year, the dates of the World Economic Forum fell right after the inauguration. So Trump, up until the last day, there was a speculation, will he, won't he? Everyone was watching the movements of helicopters, of whether or not he'll make a dash to Davos. He did end up joining via video link. So it will be really interesting to see a year on what his actual physical presence in Davos will manifest as. We know that the security operation has been tightened to other levels, not just because of Trump, but obviously with Zelensky also attending. So it will be really curious to see the dynamic on the promenade and inside the Congress Center next week.
It will be so interesting to see that dynamic, and we'll talk a bit more about that. But also wanted to ask you, in the lead up to this, there is this special survey, I understand, that the World Economic Forum releases. They kind of interview, or they survey 1,300 business leaders, academics, civil society, all these kinds of people who go to Davos, about their fears, I guess. Tell us about this.
Yes, this is their annual Global Risks Report, which they always release a few days before the annual meeting in Davos, kind of to set the tone on the risks that they see for the year ahead and the discussions that should happen while everyone is up there. And it is really interesting. They always rate these over short-term and long-term risks. So number one in short-term risks, that's in the next 2 years, most people see that as being geo-economic confrontation. But then if you look at long term, which is 10 years or more, extreme weather events was at the top of the list. If we go to the position number 2, on short term, we have misinformation and disinformation, which we know will shape up elections that are happening in the next 2 years, to long-term being biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. So you can kind of see the trend there. And I think it's really important to have these distinctions, because often when we see reports and surveys about risks or things to watch out for, it is very difficult to paint a picture because, yes, we might start to feel some of the consequences of climate change right now, but people don't see it at the top of mind when you compare it to the economics or even the prospect of war, etc. So to have this dual track of what top CEOs, civil society are thinking is really, really essential. These timeframes really help I guess, get a sense of what to expect in the next 12 months.
Well, absolutely. And within those 12 months on that short term, I just wanted to ask you, because I find that term even interesting, geo-economic confrontation, the idea that was the sort of front line and center of this year, the top risk. We talk about geopolitics, but geoeconomics, it's basically this idea, is it not, like a buzzword, conflicts because of economics, resources, fights for resources, things like that.
Yes, and they see that, one of the quotes that they have here from Borge Brende, the president and CEO of the World Economic Forum, is that, a new competitive order is taking shape as major powers seek to secure their own spheres of interest. And, these risks show that shifting landscape. And with geo-economic confrontation, 18% of respondents saw it as the risk that is most likely to trigger a global crisis in 2026. So, that's something to think about.
Which does bring us, frankly, back to Donald Trump, who will be walking the halls of Davos this year. With everything that's happened in the last even just a couple of weeks, Carlotta, I wonder if you have any sense of how he's even going to be received there, because I think in the past, last year, he would have been welcomed with a sort of, red carpet reception. But now there's just so much trepidation. Are people going to be welcoming him with open arms or staying away?
But even last year, even though he joined by video link, I was not inside the room because it was obviously oversubscribed, but right outside with the vast majority of people, but inside the Congress Center. So we were watching it on a big screen. And there was a lot of discussion among people of, the questions being quite easy, what he was being asked for being a bit of a fluff piece. And as soon as it finished, a few of us, journalists and others, one of the first people that walked out of the room, I'm not going to say as strong as stormed out of the room, but walked very purposefully out of the room, was John Kerry. So that tells you the tone of how that went down. Now, the fact that he's there is already a plus, because the theme of this year's edition of the World Economic Forum's annual meeting is a spirit of dialogue. And it's this idea that you reach out to people and you try to find common ground. You at least hear one another. And on that point, I do want to highlight, there are, 5 pressing global challenges that are anchoring the conversation that's going to happen between the public and private spheres. And that is the questions of how can we cooperate in a more contested world, how to unlock new sources of growth that ties back into the geoeconomic challenges, how to better invest in people, how to deploy innovation at scale and responsibly, and then the last one, how to build prosperity within planetary boundaries. So, that might be a nod to the tech CEOs looking to the sky. But, never have we seen a global economy that's so shaped by technology, demographics, geoeconomics. So it will be really interesting to see if this theme of a spirit of dialogue is just, the words of a press release, of it actually, triggers honest conversations while the annual meeting is going on.
Well, in the spirit of dialogue, finally, Carlotta, what are you yourself expecting? Who are you hoping to dialogue with? What are you going to be up to next week?
The amazing thing about the World Economic Forum is that you never know what to expect, Chris. As you know from when we were there, you might just be grabbing a coffee and next thing you know, you have the Prime Minister of Finland next to you and you just ask, do you have 5 minutes? Let's have a chat. So that is the wonderful thing about Davos. Now, there are a few events happening happening outside of the Congress Center that I'm quite keen to go. Few interesting discussions happening at Axios House, at the Wall Street Journal House that I want to check in. And that's the other side of it. The numbers that I mentioned of, 400 top political leaders, over 3,000 participants, that's just the accredited people. There's probably double that in terms of participants of the non-accredited. And sometimes it does pay off to step out of the Congress Center and tap into those some of the most honest, sometimes off-the-record conversations.
Carlotta Rebello, thank you very much for joining us. We will hear plenty more from you next week. The briefing itself will be hosted by Carlotta Rebello in Davos starting on Tuesday. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Annalise Maynard and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. The Briefing is back on Monday at the same time. I'm Chris Cermak. Goodbye, have a great weekend everyone, and thanks for listening.